Well, there's a great transition here, ladies and
No,
gentlemen.
there isn't. No, there is
Yes.
not.
Before we go any further, oh my God, you've made me hurt myself. Before we go any further, we must acknowledge the passing of a wrestling icon. And it's not my fault that this transition worked out that way. Antonio Inoki.
It's precisely your fault. All right.
Antonio Inoki. See, we're trying to keep the people from being too down about this. I don't know how many personal friends of Antonio Inoki's out there in the audience. I actually personally never met the man. I met Baba, didn't meet Inoki. Met Baba very in passing, and I was low on a totem pole at that point in time, so I didn't engage in any long conversation. But Inoki passed away 79 years old. The stories had been going out lately that he'd been in real bad health. I guess he'd been seen in public in a wheelchair. He was, hospitalized or assisted living or something or other. But, Brian, we can't do, if we tried to do chapter and verse on the career of Antonio Inoki and just hit the high points, we'd still be here for 5 hours, and that'd be the only thing we'd talk about on the program. But as an introduction to any of the younger folks out there who accidentally listen to us, or anybody who hasn't, followed the history of Japanese wrestling, is there ever been anybody in the United States in the wrestling industry as over, as mainstream, as well-known, as popular in our culture as Inoki was in theirs? Maybe Jim Londos years ago when, the world title matches were reported in the newspapers. Everybody knew who he was, but still, was that even approaching Inoki's status in Japan?
I don't think so. He's one of the most significant and interesting figures in the history of wrestling. He's one of those few figures that you could actually say if he wasn't in wrestling, the entire business is radically changed.
Yeah.
He is one of the most important figures ever. And you really can't think of too many people in this culture that would have reached that level on a national basis. I mean, Hulk Hogan got really famous on a national basis. Hulk Hogan could never run for Congress, more than likely. Antonio Inoki, through his own booking, made himself one of the biggest sports stars in his country and parlayed that fame into much greater fame.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, Hulk Hogan was in movies and he was on TV and blah, blah, blah. There's levels of celebrity in every culture, in every country. And we're not trying to downplay Hogan. I would say the same thing about Steve Austin and The Rock, to be honest. The Rock, who now the most successful movie star in Hollywood. He's still not as big, as important, as popular, as beloved, as, thought of as Inoki was in that culture. And, he outlasted Baba by, it's been 20 years since Baba passed away, right? So, I mean, Baba didn't have, I don't think, the aspirations of becoming a politician, and he wasn't probably as egocentric as Inoki with how he promoted himself. It was more about his company and his business rather than just me. But they were neck and neck, for 30 years, but Inoki outlasted him. Inoki branched out. Inoki did other things, some successfully and some, laid all kinds of fucking eggs. But
he was 5 years younger than Baba, which is an interesting part of the story because remember, they debuted on the same day in 1960.
Yeah.
They're both the prize students of Ricky Dozan, biggest star, history of Japanese wrestling, the owner of the biggest promotion or the only promotion at that time in Japanese wrestling. Baba, almost right away, got a good push. Pretty soon after he debuted, he went to the States. Inoki hung back. Inoki was washing Ricky Dozan's back.
Yeah.
So I think there always was a real professional competition between Inoki in his head and Baba. Remember, Inoki quit JWA to start an opposition group in 1966, while Baba was the biggest star in JWA. And then when he comes back, that's when finally they're both in Japan. Inoki's more established. They put them together as a tag team. And for the next several years, the biggest thing in Japanese wrestling is Baba and Inoki as a team.
And remember when there was only one promotion, they had two network time slots for TV, did they not? So at one point, Inoki would be the star on one program, Baba would be the star on the other program. But they were, inextricably linked with each other, and both of them wanted to go out on their own. Inoki had tried to do it first and then ended up getting moved out when he tried to do it again. And it ended up that both of them within the same calendar year left to start their own promotions, and it killed the original one, the JWA.
And you bring up the TV, it's important to note that when Baba leaves after everything that went down with Inoki at the end of 71 into 72, Baba knows he has the relationship with the TV station. They want Baba more than they want JWA. Baba's the star. So having that relationship and being good with money and having his wife, I guess, in the office.
Yeah.
He had the children of Ricky Dozan on his side too, in terms of just how it looks to the public. He was ready to make his move. He was better set up. It took Inoki a while to get TV. And of course, JWA had to go out of business.
That's honestly, everybody talks about El Santo in Mexico. And again, same situation. He was more, and still is to this day, over and beloved and popular and mainstream in his culture in Mexico than any counterpart here in this country. But Japan had three of them right in a row. Ricky Dozan was the single most popular sports figure in Japan in the 50s and early 60s. His two handpicked students, Baba and Inoki, become the leaders of wrestling in Japan for the next 30 years after that. You mentioned, Baba immediately got a push over here because of his size. Nobody had ever seen a Japanese wrestler that size before, that height, and it was just freakish, and that's why he was used in main events. And Inoki was always upset about that. He got sent for his excursion to America and ended up working, for $30 a night or whatever for Nick Goulas in Tennessee and over in Kingsport. And,
Baba main evented the Garden.
Yeah. Baba not only main evented the Garden and the Olympic Auditorium, New York and Los Angeles, but challenged for two of the three major, or maybe all three of the major world titles at the time. On his trip over here, and Inoki gets, it gets sent to Tennessee Purgatory to be another rotating unknown Japanese wrestler. So he never forgot that either. That's why 10 years later, he buys the NWF, the Buffalo and Cleveland promotion from Pedro Martinez, so he can be the world champion of a promotion in America and use that publicity in Japan to make himself look even bigger.
Later on, it actually went into the development of the IWGP.
The International Wrestling Grand Prix. And boy, by the way, when you think about, again, the moves that Inoki was making, and nobody really in the wrestling business in this country was paying attention at this time. Inoki comes over and buys a promotion in Cleveland and Buffalo to make himself the world champion. That's what, 1973 through 74? But thereabouts?
Somewhere around there, it beats Johnny Powers.
Right. By 1976, the match between him and Muhammad Ali is being advertised or talked about or publicized in every newspaper in the country here because it's Muhammad Ali. But nobody knew who the fuck Antonio, even the wrestling fans of those days, nobody knew who Antonio Inoki was in this country because of the lack of home video, television. Even the wrestling magazines didn't give incredible amounts of coverage to Japan. So it was really only the diehards. Go ahead.
You have to remember, too, because this plays a big part in everything. When Baba starts All Japan and Inoki has New Japan, there's also a shift that now you have two companies with two different styles. It's all pro wrestling, But Baba was more an Americanized style of Japanese wrestling, and Inoki went the strong style, I guess is what we call it. More of a Karl Gotch influence than Giant Baba had there.
I don't know if I'd call it strong style now, because it may give people the impression that it sucked with what they're seeing now. But it was, at that point, it was a pro wrestling style that tried to make things more credible, to look more like a fight, like a contest, like an athletic, exhibition of some kind. And he used a lot more different style fighters, because we mentioned Baba could get the American talent. He had the booking agreement with the NWA.
That was what I was going to say right there. That's why he had to buy the NWF title, because Baba could become NWA champion, and Inoki couldn't become a recognized world champion unless he made himself the champion.
Exactly. But also, that's why Baba's promotion, and with Dorian Terry Funk being the American bookers and them getting the best NWA talent, Baba's promotion became the promotion for the premier in-ring workers and the American style. And he would send like Jumbo or Tenryu or whoever his young guys were that he wanted to bring up. He'd send them to Texas to train with the Funks, and send them to the Carolinas to train with the best NWA talent in the ring. And then they'd come back and they'd be prepared for that. Well, with Inoki, we mentioned on other programs, he had the booking arrangement with Vince Sr. for the WWF, but that didn't happen until the late 70s.
And he couldn't get their world champion.
Because Bruno was beholden to Baba. Pedro, I don't think would have meant that much.
And they got Backlund.
And they got Backlund.
And they had that world title change, which was only recognized in Japan. He was able to do that with Backlund. There was going to be no business with Bruno Sammartino and Antonio Inoki.
But that's the thing. Since he had to use the WWF guys, he also used guys from Mexico, from Europe, Germany, the Steve Wrights, or the World of Sport guys. It was more of a melting pot of wrestling styles and combat styles than anywhere else in the world at that point, because of the talent that he brought in. And Inoki had a way of presenting himself, his demeanor, his stance in the ring. He always was in great shape, and he had credibility, even though he'd never been a big time shooter or had any, tremendous amateur credentials. He carried himself and he booked himself, and he made you believe that he was this badass fighter, not just wrestler, but fighter. And the thing with Ali, even though that went south for a while, he knew the concept would work. And then there was Everett Eddy, the karate guy, and Willem Ruska, and all these different martial arts disciplines that he would bring these guys in and have these mixed matches to prove that pro wrestling was the dominant fighting style and that he was the baddest fighter in the world. And it fucking worked, and nobody else had done it at that point on any kind of organized mainstream, level for any length of time. And it worked for him. And that's why, I think honestly, Baba ended up realizing when he got older, especially with his size and physical drawbacks, he moved himself down the card. He put himself in the comedy match so people could see him, but he wouldn't embarrass himself. And it wasn't about keeping himself on top as the champion, the main event. Even when Inoki moved guys like Fujinami or Kimura or whoever up to, the main events, he never wanted to get out of the way. And he was always going to figure out a way to keep himself on top. It was just a difference in the way they viewed themselves.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, you have to remember with Inoki is he may be the single greatest, example's not the word, I'm trying to think of exactly how to phrase this. There may be no other promoter who promoted themselves as a wrestling star more successfully than he did.
True, yes. An exemplary self-promoter.
There was no Vince McMahon saying, hey, Hulkster, I think you should do this. Sometimes he made the wrong move, but he knew what Antonio Inoki should do. He was in control of himself.
And, that's the thing, is that if it was a situation like, okay, Big Daddy in England, the brother's the promoter and it's a gimmick and there's no substance, but it's a craze. But, Inoki fit the part. It wasn't like he was just pushing himself because he owned the thing. He did fit the part. He looked the part. He could work. He could handle himself, apparently, especially if anybody wants to have a tickle, look up the match with the great Antonio and Antonio Inoki from, what was that, mid-60s?
No, that was like 78, 79.
Was it that late?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
my God. Okay, but anyway, the great Antonio still thought he was great, and the other Antonio let him know that he wasn't. But, that's the thing. The impact or the influence that Inoki had on mixed martial arts. That's why there have been several books now written about the Ali Inoki match, even though it was a disaster to watch and it fell apart from being a work to a shoot at the last minute. It was the start of mixed martial arts in the modern era. And it wasn't even like we said, the only example he was doing that. Inoki was doing that with lesser known names, obviously, but in their worlds, these guys were significant fighters in their own disciplines. And as a result of that, Inoki created that aura about himself, but also if it had not been for a lot of that, a lot of those guys that got involved, the world of mixed martial arts may look a lot different today because they've all had direct, impact and influence on what MMA does today. All of the guys that most all the guys, maybe not Leon Spinks.
Maybe not Leon Spinks, that's true. But it also is something to note that later on in life, towards the end of his run as the owner of New Japan Pro Wrestling, he did do a lot of damage, many would argue, by booking his top stars, the guys that were in the process of being booked well or about to be booked well, against actual MMA guys in shoots, and his guys would get destroyed. And that helped really hurt New Japan and overall pro wrestling. It ruined the myth in Japan that the pro wrestler was the toughest athlete in the world.
Which they legitimately did think for a period of time in the 60s and 70s, maybe the 50s with Ricky Dozan. They legitimately believed in Japan that wrestlers were the toughest all-around athletes. And now, again, it's a tribute to Inoki and Baba and what they took that Ricky Dozan handed off to them and operated for, nearly 30 years. It's a tribute to them that's why today the modern wrestlers and the modern really hardcore fans have such a romanticized notion of what it's like to go to Japan now or to wrestle in Japan now. Well, yes, if you're in a main event of fucking giant Tokyo Dome show, that's a big deal. But the same thing has happened in Japan as has happened in the United States. Wrestling is less important. It's more hokey and foolish. There's a lot more outlaw talent involved. Now, to add to the problems in modern Japanese wrestling, almost all the top American talent is contractually forbidden to go there rather than being brought in on a regular basis, which is obviously why you see, every American, and I say American, and that counts for the people from the UK or whatever, the gaijin talent in Japan now is the guys that couldn't be signed to the big American companies, not the best of them. So I guess the point I'm making is it's because of what Inoki and Baba were able to do with the wrestling business and establish it as a network TV property and the biggest stars as the most popular professional athletes in the country. And, the business that they did, that's why the people still look on Japanese wrestling today as a mythological place. Of course, it's not anymore. It's the same thing, like we said, it's happened over there. It's gone to shit. But it's still from the people there and the people that experienced it during the golden era. It was the place to be. You made more money there at one point than you made in America. As we said, they got the pick of the absolute best talent. It was an honor to be picked to go to Japan for either Baba or Inoki, or if some friend of yours got you a tour as a favor or whatever the case. And it was a big deal. But you had to have it. Did what happened to Vince also happen to Inoki earlier as he got older, like you mentioned, with the destroying his own guys with the shooters and the weird hybrid shoot fight promotions that he tried to start in later years? And it did the same thing happen where Vince just in his own mind kind of lost it and thought, I like this, everybody else will too.
Maybe to a point. I mean, very different people, but even like in the mid-90s, when Ricky Choshu was the booker, there were still guys that may not have liked what Inoki was doing, although he was still the biggest star there. I mean, his retirement, you see those Tokyo Dome shows now, people rave about the matches, and they talk about what a big deal it is. Go watch the Tokyo Dome shows with Inoki. Go watch the 98 retirement. That's 70,000 people in there. It's a whole different thing. I think with Inoki, he got swept up in everything happening with MMA. And specifically in Japan, we probably can't gauge in America how big Pride was over there. And that was started by Takada. That was his guy. He started Takada. So he got very mixed up in that. And I think it did a number on Japanese wrestling. Sometimes you think, is there a way that it could have existed without doing that? And I don't know, but he got very involved with that. And he got very involved with that kind of style. So you wonder, is it just the next iteration of everything he had always been working towards in terms of strong style? Or was it like Mick Jagger making a hip hop song? Like, I'm going to try to stay with the times.
There was a lot of freak show matches.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That he would go with that even more so than you would think coming from a guy with a pro wrestling background. He went into the oddities period and China as a person wrestling men. And I guess maybe with the Japanese culture, that was kind of shocking enough to get over and get attention. But, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm a big mark. I'd like to know what you think, because I know you were getting the tapes. I'm a big mark, to use that term, for New Japan Wrestling from, like, let's say 81 to 86, 87.
Yeah.
Which is that whole IWGP period, all the junior heavyweights doing their thing, which it's still maybe my favorite junior heavyweight wrestling in the history of wrestling. You had the freak shows, Andre is a heel, Hogan was coming into his own, and then into that period where Akira Maeda and the UWF folded and Maeda came back and he has Fujiwara and Takada and everyone else, and they feuded with Inoki and New Japan. That's like my favorite period of time there where he's just such a star. I mean, you watch it, there's no one else who's a level of star like he is. From the moment he comes out there, walking to the ring, you brought up his intensity and just him moving around, making eye contact. Watch him making eye contact with the guys wrestling in those matches. He's staring them down before they do anything.
Yeah, it didn't come off in any way like that, we're going to have a friendly exhibition here. He looked like he was a fucking lion, salivating over a fucking raw steak. And, I guess that's the thing with those years, as we mentioned, you had such a wide variety of styles. And you could see Tiger Mask and Dynamite Kid, or again, Kobayashi and Steve Wright, who was tremendous. And some of the other, and Black Tiger, Mark Rocco, and some of those other matches. The first Japanese tape I ever saw in 1980, right after I got my VCR, a good probability I got it from Walt Wolanski in Philadelphia. I got 95% of my Japanese tapes from him, but the first one was one of Inoki's shows and one of Baba's shows, like they were on the weekend. Okay, so this was the weekend. And Baba's show had Terry Funk versus Jumbo Tsuruta. And they go 30 minutes to a Broadway, and I'm like, the work was incredible. These are two of the best technicians in the business at that time. And then you watch Inoki show, and there's Gran Hamada in a junior heavyweight match against Babyface. Remember him, the little luchador from Mexico? Yeah. And the first thing is Babyface takes a bump out on the floor, and Hamada runs up to the top rope, jumps off the top rope to the floor with a flying crossbody 2/3 the way across the ring on this guy. And I'm like, holy shit, because at that time, Randy Savage would do the double axe handle off the top rope to the floor. And maybe every once in a while, somebody else crazy would jump and do something like that. Otherwise, you never saw that at that point in time. And it wasn't like they were doing acrobatic cheerleading routines. They still didn't lose the aspect of a contest. But Inoki's in-ring of his promotion was completely different from Baba's. It was two different promotions and two different products, but it was all so fucking serious and everybody was over. And that's something we can't, duplicate today.
They were network TV stars. That's the other thing. Because remember, eventually wrestling lost network TV. They lost prime time. They lost everything they had. And that's when the company started going downhill, both companies. But Inoki and Baba were network TV stars, primetime network TV stars. I'm not sure off the top of my head how many channels they had over there at that time, but
I think there were 2 networks. If I'm not mistaken, one of the listeners in the cult that knows their Japanese broadcasting, were there just 2 networks? There was Asahi and
Nippon
and
TV?
Fuji, right? Or Nippon.
Maybe 3 networks.
Maybe 3. Maybe 3. Well, the point is, if there were 3, Baba was on one, Inoki was on one of the other ones, so they were network TV, and there was no cable. But here's something else: the Japanese wrestling magazines. I started obviously taking pictures and sending them to the Japanese magazines before I'd ever seen a Japanese match. Koichi Yoshizawa, who was one of the great correspondents back then from Japan, who wrote for the magazines there.
I have so many
took pictures. Oh, yes. He would send you pictures, and he would send this Xeroxed result sheet of all of the results from every show run in the country of Japan during the period of time that it covered, like once a month. But they were handwritten. He didn't have a typewriter that could write in English. So they were handwritten by a Japanese guy that English writing was his second writing language, and you could barely decipher it, right? And I'm ashamed to say that I think I dumped those years ago. But he started asking for my pictures, and he was my agent for the magazine. I would send Koichi the pictures. He would give them to the magazine people. Whatever they used, they'd send me a check. This was in 77, 78, 79. I'd get checks for $100, $150 from Gong Magazine for sending them $3 worth of fucking prints or whatever. And what is that in today's money? Even more is what it is. But you would see these insane scenes and these wild-looking people, and the photography in these magazines was better than anything in America. And the printing, the paper, and the full color sections. And they sold hundreds of thousands of copies of these things. Remember Weekly Pro, Gong Magazine? The same people that published the baseball magazines published the wrestling magazines in Japan. And that was the 2 most popular sports. And so, they sold hundreds of thousands of these things a week that were the size of, they were square bound, so hundreds of pages. And the wrestling mania, that was the first merchandising, right? All the guys that went to Japan got T-shirts, and the fucking wrestling memorabilia was sold over there long before Vince started or anybody had any ideas in this country of doing things officially licensed, but they had the network TV to push it. Even the records. Remember, Terry Funk did a fucking album. If that doesn't show you that they'll buy anything with I love Terry Funk, but he can't sing.
Hey, we talked about Inoki buying championships, and again, he had the WWF championship briefly, and created the IWGP later on. Do you remember from when you were a fan the coverage in the magazines? Because there was some in the States of him versus Strong Kobayashi, because that was kind of a big deal at the time, because Kobayashi had been the biggest star for IWE, and he jumped to lose to Inoki.
Yes, and Kobayashi was somewhat of a name in parts of this country because he'd had a long run in the AWA and had worked a few of the other territories. And I think that's Inoki, you can see going through his career and the career or the time that New Japan was under his control, he would always bring in an ex-rival or an ex-competitor or somebody from another company, and they would be featured strongly, but invariably they would end up losing to Inoki, but he brought in and brought back to the fold a lot of those guys and figured out some way to get the most out of everybody as it related to getting himself over. And I'm trying.
He got Vader over. Did Leon ever tell you about wrestling Inoki?
Oh, yes, because, well, that was the thing is, remember the two most controversial finishes that I can think of in New Japan history. Well, I mean, there's the, Maeda shoot kick and all that stuff. But seriously, Inoki and Hogan in the IWGP final, where allegedly, and still to this day, who, is anybody definitively sure? We believe it was probably a work because it worked out so well. But Hogan knocked Inoki out unconscious with the clothesline, the axe bomber, right, that Hogan used. And Inoki's down on the floor, unconscious, gets counted out, loses. Nobody saw that coming. And that was a major deal in Japanese wrestling for decades after that. And then, like you said, when he decides he wants to make a new monster and brings Leon in to be Vader, thank God it wasn't Ultimate Warrior. That was the first pick, and that would have been abysmal.
And for the record, for anyone listening, if Ultimate Warrior had not signed with Vince, he was going to be Vader.
Yes.
Big Van Vader.
Big Van Vader. But instead it falls to Leon, and Leon was perfect for it. But Inoki did, what was it? Was it 3 minutes? Did the job for Leon for Vader on his debut in 3 minutes in, was it Sumo Hall?
Sumo Hall. Guy who never loses quickly to a brand new wrestler no one had ever seen before.
And the people went bullshit. And it caused such a run. They set shit on fire. And they threw all their seat cushions in the ring. And they did. Japanese are not exactly like fucking Colombians when it comes to having street riots, but they tried their best. And how long was wrestling banned from the building after that? For like a year or two?
Oh, yeah. And you see, that's heat you never had, where people turn around and light their own seats on fire.
Yeah, fuck you. We're going to light ourselves on fire. We were so pissed off about that. But it was shocking. Nobody could imagine that happened. And that was, but
he was made. Beauty. But Vader was made.
Yeah, that's the beauty of when somebody protects themselves or has been protected for a long time and well. When they do go to make somebody, it fucking works. But they got to be trying to make them as well. It can't be like, oh, Hulk Hogan did a job for Kidman. Yeah.
Did Vince ever talk about Inoki?
No. See, that's the thing. That Vince McMahon, in the last, 10 years, has been the American promoter that has acknowledged Antonio Inoki and his company and his legacy and his existence more than anybody else in wrestling since Inoki was actually wrestling regularly. And I got to be honest with you, I don't know that I ever heard Vince. I mean, obviously they'd done the Madison Square Garden series, and Vince used to go over for the big, events, but he never mentioned Inoki like, oh, that Antonio, what a great guy. His name never came up.
I took his $1 million and I never gave him Hogan again. You're going to lose Andre next year, too.
Boy, that was heat, by the way. $1 million. And a year later, Andre and Hogan are both fucking gone. But anyway, but yeah, that's the thing. I mean, we're talking about, and I know a lot of the kids out there are going to be going, oh, golly, there's Tanahashi and Okada. They're so much more popular and they're better wrestlers. Well, I'm sorry. I know you hate to hear this, but there is not a professional wrestler in the history, as we've mentioned, of the United States, and only two in the history of Japan that can compare with the magnitude, the popularity, the recognition value, the accomplishments, the overness of Antonio Inoki anywhere in the world. And Santo, Ricky Dozan, Inoki, and Baba. And I know somebody's going to say, well, there was a big Peruvian hero. Well, we're getting down to fucking picking nits now, folks. Let's go with the big four. There's your Mount Rushmore of pro wrestling. The most influential, popular, successful, and ultimately well-known individuals in their culture in a sport that pretty much came from America. None of them are American. Your thoughts?
You know, the other interesting thing, too, is Japan is known for having traditionally reserved fans who sit there and respectfully watch the wrestling and respectfully react to the wrestling. Go watch the reaction Antonio Inoki got. in that environment, people screaming his name, people chanting with him. He was a level of star bigger than Baba. I mean, you have to say it. It took a while to surpass Baba, but eventually he did, and he became much bigger than Baba. You'll never see another guy come along like that probably ever again. And if they do, it'll have to be a similar path. I'm going to be the promoter. I'm going to book myself, and I'm going to do it really smart. That's the only way it can happen.
And then I'm going to get elected to Congress. But no, those people, when you watch the videos, the people are jumping up at, I mean, these are not like 12-year-old girls about the Beatles. It's grown adults trembling in his presence and jumping up and down just to see him. And they hear the music and they go out of their minds. And it's, you know, I think it would have more impact on people in the United States seeing it if it was in the United States, because they think, well, those crazy people in foreign countries. But no, this was over. So
it'd be a bigger story in the United States if Bad News Bears 3 was a bigger hit movie. Remember they went to Japan and Inoki wrestled in it?
Yes. And that was, but now here's the thing again. No pro wrestlers in 1976 got parts in movies in this country, pretty much. But there's Antonio Inoki pops up in the Bad News Bears Go to Japan. Anyway, that's, you know, I mean, just read up on him or go watch some stuff on YouTube. And thankfully, the Japanese tape libraries were taken so much better care of than all the American libraries. They're still, you know, they have compilation videos of the great matches of Inoki and Baba going back to the 60s that still exist because they were shot by network television and they were important at the time and they, you know, kept these things. You know, it may be an acquired taste until you understand what everybody worked like in the company in New Japan in those days. And then you'll say, okay, I get this. And the people are fucking loving it. So we're sorry to hear about that. But I guess if Inoki was 5 years younger than Baba, Baba would be 84 by now. And that's wild. Here's another thing about Inoki. Did anybody ever come back from more scandals in the wrestling business or anywhere else? Not only he had wrestling scandals, he had political scandals. He had, you know, some major flops. There was the embezzlement scandal because he was taking money. Wasn't it him or was it, oh, goddamn.
Well, Shinma took the hit. But it was Inoki, I believe.
Shinma took the hit for it and was disgraced, but there was talk by Sayama that they were taking money from the wrestling promotion to finance Inoki's cattle ranch in Brazil or whatever the fuck. Were there any, until Vince McMahon went public and became a billionaire with the stock, Inoki and Baba were also the two wealthiest wrestling promoters in history also, right? They had more money than anybody And I mean, obviously, Tony Khan now or Vince as a billionaire doesn't count. But in those days, they were the richest wrestling promoters in the world.
I would have to think that's true. Remember, even someone like El Santo, no one ever talks about El Santo's great wealth or anything. Baba and Inoki, and I think Baba may have actually had more money, if I'm not mistaken.
I think, well, because Inoki made some more questionable decisions. Baba was the steady, quiet, honest, soft-spoken guy, didn't like to attract a lot of attention. Inoki's out there, look at me! So, but anyway, they both made a ton of money in their time. And Brian, that's what it's all about. That's what people want to do. They want to make a ton of money, or at least a few ounces. Well, you can do that with our friends at Prize Picks, right?
I believe so. What an interesting transition we have there. But, Giant Baba used to be a pitcher for the Giants over in Tokyo.
He was the Omiuri Giants, I believe.
I believe that is correct. Of course, he would leave pitching to become a professional wrestler, but perhaps he was on the mound today. How do you think someone like Giant Baba statistically would do against someone like Shohei Ohtani, the best pitcher in the American League?
Well, since I don't know who the hell Shohei Ohtani is, otherwise than he stole Giant Baba's first name, I'd say he won't do well. But what do you think, folks? Because our friends at Prize Picks will take the projections and they'll give them to you, and it's you versus the projections, and you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. It's daily fantasy the way you like to play it, and you can make entries easily on the player projections, and then you can select more or less. And if you select more, well, that means you get more. And if you select less, that means, well, you get less. Doesn't it? Or does it? Maybe I don't know how this works.
Maybe I don't even know what you said.
Well, there you go, folks. Prize Picks offers projections on any sport you watch. NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, PGA, college football, men's college basketball, women's college basketball. They ought to have intergender college basketball. Soccer, WNBA, esports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, Euro basketball, cricket, and the ever-popular and highly exciting disc golf. You can make entries fast in 60 seconds or less. Boy, don't you wish you could get 60 seconds or less entry to everything in your life. You can make safe and fast withdrawals. You don't even need to pull a gun or any kind of weapon. And Prize Picks is currently operational in over 30 states. That means apparently there's just under 20 that haven't got with the program. And Canada. Folks, right now, download Yes, that's what I said. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com right now to sign up and play the daily fantasy sports. Everybody needs a good fantasy during the day. First-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code JCE. You put in 100, they'll give you 100. You only put in 50, they're only going to give you 50. What do you think this is? Make-A-Wish? Goddamn charity? They're only going to give you what you put into it. You got to do some of the work. But folks, don't forget to enter promo code JCE at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100, and then fire away at these projections and out-project them, and you can win up to 10 times your money. And folks, if you know what you're doing, then go with it from there. PrizePicks.com.
That's right. Win some money. Prize Picks.